Hi friends. Please subscribe and help me get my first 1,000 subscribers. It's one click for you, but for me it's a huge encouragement and motivation. Thank you to everyone who has already subscribed. I hope you enjoy this story. Let's go. Maggie sat at the window of her office on the 14th floor, looking out at the city that shimmered with thousands of lights at sunset. It had once been an inspiring sight, but now it was just a reminder of the emptiness that was eating her up inside. Behind her she could hear the familiar hum of office chatter, but everything seemed so far away, as if she were looking at her life through a clouded glass. "Maggie, are you coming to dinner with us?" Claire, her young colleague, ran energetically to her table, waving an invitation. "Tonight is to celebrate the success of the new project. You have to be there." Maggie smiled strangely. The idea of spending the evening with her co-workers didn't appeal to her, but being alone in an empty house wasn't something she wanted to do. "Yeah, why not?" she said, forcing herself to sound cheerful. "I need to unwind a little." The evening began with a raucous dinner in a modern restaurant. Claire and the other young employees discussed their weekend plans, shared memes and laughed loudly. Maggie, sitting slightly off to the side, felt superfluous. Suddenly, a familiar voice sounded. "It looks like you're thinking somewhere far away," Ryan said, appearing with a glass of wine and a smile that always seemed overly confident. She looked up and felt a slight heat run across her skin. "Ryan, I didn't expect to see you here. Aren't you supposed to be in another meeting?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "I think I deserve a night off," he winked, sitting down next to her. "How are you? Aren't you bored here with us grown-ups?" Maggie laughed, almost heartily. It was the first time in a long time that someone had made her feel alive. "You'd be surprised, but sometimes it's even nice to be among these noisy young people." She looked at the group, who were now animatedly discussing the upcoming concert. "But yeah, sometimes I feel older than I am." Ryan looked at her carefully, and his gaze seemed too penetrating. "You're not older at all. It's just that something inside you seems to say differently," he said quietly, and there was a strange sincerity in his voice. Maggie looked away to hide the sudden wave of emotion that rose in her chest. She realized that this wasn't just a friendly conversation. Their conversation gradually drifted into personal reminiscences and jokes. Soon the restaurant began to empty and they were alone among the empty tables. "It's late, I have to go home," she said, but she didn't move. "Do you want me to walk you home?" Ryan offered, his voice low and almost hypnotic. "Thanks, but no thanks," her words sounded unsure. "Maggie," Ryan leaned closer, his eyes glittering in the dim light. "You deserve more than just a job and a routine." She held her breath as his words echoed in her mind like an echo of her own thoughts. "It's complicated, Ryan. I have to go." Maggie stood up, trying to avoid further discussion. "Okay," he said, helping her into her coat and touching her shoulder lightly. "But if you change your mind, know where to find me." Maggie walked outside, feeling anxious and confused. Dan was at home, busy with yet another project, his voice, monotonous and tired, already echoing in her head. "You're late, Maggie, is everything okay?" Dan asked, not lifting his eyes from his laptop when she walked in. "Yeah, just late for dinner with my co-workers." She tried to sound casual, but her heart was still racing from seeing Ryan. Dan nodded, returning to his work, and Maggie felt the wall of silence grow between them again. She walked silently to the bedroom where the silence that pressed on her chest awaited her until she closed her eyes and remembered his gaze, his words, his touch. Maggie woke up the next day with a headache from lack of sleep and guilt. But thoughts of Ryan continued to plague her. At lunch in the office, she suddenly noticed him walking over to her desk. "You don't look so chipper today," he said with a smile. "It's been a long night," she replied, trying not to look him in the eye. "Maybe some coffee would help." "Come on, it's my treat," Ryan offered, and she surprisingly agreed. The coffee shop was quiet, and they found a table by the window. Maggie took the cup in her hands, hoping the hot coffee would soothe the trembling in her fingers. "You think a lot, am I right?" Ryan interrupted the silence. "What makes you think that?" She raised her eyebrows even though she knew he could see right through her. "I just noticed the way you look away like you're looking for something. That night was no accident, Maggie." Her heart skipped a beat, but before she could answer, his phone vibrated. He looked at the screen and cursed quietly. "I've got to go. I'll be back in the office in a couple days, but I have a proposition." He stood up, slowly approaching. "If you need a change of scenery, come visit me. I'm just finishing up with the move and need help with the design." Maggie remained seated at the table, unable to believe her ears and trying to cope with her feelings. "See you later, Maggie." Ryan nodded goodbye and walked away, leaving her alone with a storm of thoughts. Friday night found Maggie in front of the bathroom mirror. Her hands nervously adjusted her hair, searching her reflection for something she hadn't seen in a long time, a spark of youth, courage, a willingness to do something new. She could hear Dan downstairs on the phone discussing another presentation. His voice, which had become a familiar backdrop to her life, no longer evoked the emotion it used to. "Are you going somewhere?" Dan appeared in the bathroom doorway, surprised by her outfit. He glanced at her dark dress, perfectly emphasizing her figure, and froze. "Yeah, dinner with coworkers." "You said you were working late tonight," she said, trying to sound casual. "Yes, of course. I just didn't expect it." "You look beautiful." His voice was a mixture of surprise and something else she hadn't heard in a long time, approval. But it didn't move her the way it should have. "Thank you," Maggie nodded, and feeling the silence between them thicken again added, "Don't take too long, okay?" Dan averted his eyes, then sighed and walked off into the study, where the light from the laptop screen colored his face with a bluish glow. When Maggie reached the apartment building where Ryan lived, her heart was beating with such force that its pounding seemed to be audible throughout the entryway. The doorbell rang softly and discreetly, but a moment later the door swung open and Ryan, wearing dark pants and a light-colored shirt slightly unbuttoned, stood before her with a wide smile. "Welcome, Maggie. Glad you came." His voice was warm and confident. "Thank you," she replied, feeling her voice tremble. "Pinot Grigio?" he offered, raising his glass. She nodded, and soon the cold glass was touching her fingers. They walked into the spacious living room, furnished with elegant simplicity. The soft light of the lamps reflected on the glossy floor, creating a cozy atmosphere. "You've done a good job on the interior," Maggie said, looking around. "Clean, modern, but warm." "I'm glad you noticed that. But I'm still missing some details in the bedroom. Would you like to take a look?" Ryan offered, his voice low and barely audible. Maggie froze. That invitation, hidden behind the words about design, seemed to be a hint, and her heart fluttered again. She could not say no. It was as if an invisible force propelled her forward, and she nodded. Ryan gently placed his hand on her back and led her down the hall. The bedroom was dimly lit, the large windows offering a view of the city at night. The walls were painted a deep gray, and the bed was made with white sheets neatly tucked into the corners. "This is what I wanted to show you." Ryan turned around and looked at her, waiting for her reaction. "It's beautiful," she said quietly, but her voice shook not from contemplating the interior. Ryan stepped closer, his fingers touching her shoulder, and she didn't pull away. The silence became palpable, like the air before a thunderstorm. They stood like that, silent, until he leaned over and touched his lips to her neck. Maggie closed her eyes, feeling her body respond to every movement, every note of his closeness. "Ryan," she began, but the words were lost in the depths of her desire. "Shoo," he whispered, and it was the last thing she heard before everything around her dissolved into heat and passion. Later, as silence filled the room again, Maggie lay next to Ryan, watching the lights of the city flicker on. Feelings overwhelmed her: guilt, satisfaction, euphoria, and fear. It all blended into one unbreakable ball. "What now?" she asked, daring to speak. "What do you want it to be?" Ryan answered, his gaze soft, but the tension in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Maggie thought of Dan, of their life together, which now seemed distant and ghostly. She felt panic overwhelm her. What had she done? "I don't know," she whispered, feeling tears come to her eyes. Ryan reached out and stroked her hair. "It's going to be okay," he said, but his words seemed empty. Returning home deep into the night, Maggie froze when she saw a light on in the hallway. Dan stood at the door, his face shadowed, but the tension in his posture was prominent. "Where have you been so late?" His voice was quiet, but there was a sharp steel in it. "Dinner with coworkers ran late," she replied, trying not to give away the tremor in her voice. "Colleagues?" Dan took a slow step toward her, his eyes cold. "Are you sure?" "What do you mean?" Her heart dropped. Dan stared at her in silence, and there was something in his gaze that Maggie had never seen before: suspicion and pain. He stepped closer, and the tension in the room became as palpable as an electric shock. "Maggie," he began, his voice barely audible, "you've changed lately. I can see it and feel it. Is there something you're not telling me?" Maggie froze, her heart pounding frantically in her chest. She couldn't find the words to explain what was happening, and she couldn't admit it. That would be the end of it, and she knew it. Her silence only added to Dan's suspicions. He sighed, stepped back, and ran a hand through his hair, as if trying to control his emotions. "You know, I'm willing to accept a lot of things. We all go through hard times, but I'm not ready to be the one who gets cheated. Do you realize what this means for us?" He continued, his voice growing more and more strained. Dan, she started, but the words stuck in her throat. She lowered her eyes, unable to bear his gaze. You were with him, weren't you? He asked finally, and there was an almost pleading tone in his voice, a desire to hear denial. Maggie felt a cold fear sweep over her. The seconds stretched on, and the air in the room grew thick and heavy. She couldn't deny the obvious, but it was impossible to tell the truth either. Oh, we need to talk, she whispered, looking down at the floor. I've already figured it out, Maggie. Dan's voice shook, and his eyes flashed with pain for a moment, which was immediately replaced by icy determination. I'm going away on a business trip tomorrow. When I get back, we'll talk about what happens next. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the semi-darkness of the empty room. Maggie heard him slam the office door, and the silence she fell into was unbearable. She sank down on the couch, feeling the whole world collapse around her. The next few days passed in agonizing anticipation. Dan was indeed away on a business trip, and Maggie was left alone, swallowing guilt and fear. Ryan hadn't called, and that strangely calmed and worried her at the same time. She needed time to figure out what to do next, but every day without Dan seemed like torture. Friday night, Maggie sat at the kitchen table looking at her phone. She wanted to dial Ryan's number to hear his voice, but she was afraid she'd be even more confused about how she felt. Suddenly the phone rang and her heart jumped. But it wasn't the number she expected. Hey Maggie. It's Haley, came a familiar voice. Haley? Maggie was surprised, uncertainty in her voice. Yeah. I thought you'd want to know what's going on with Dan. I saw him in the office today before he left for a client meeting. Did he say anything about our situation? Maggie asked, holding her breath. No, but he didn't look, not the best, to be honest. Haley was silent for a moment, as if considering something. Look, I know you're having a hard time, but I want you to understand that Dan deserves better. What are you trying to say? Maggie felt a sense of threat brewing inside her. I'm saying that if you really love him, think about what's best for him. Sometimes love requires hard decisions. Haley's voice was soft, but there was an underlying threat in it. Maggie froze, clutching the phone until her fingers ached. Haley knew or suspected what was going on, and her intervention was a sign that the situation was beyond her personal control. Thanks for your concern, Haley, but it's none of your business, Maggie replied, trying to keep her composure. Maybe, Haley replied and hung up. After the conversation, Maggie felt the fear and anger begin to turn into determination. She needed to talk to Dan and try to get back what she had destroyed. Maggie prepared for Dan's return from his business trip, her heart clenched with anxiety and a sense of inevitability. During these days of solitude, she tried to make sense of everything that had happened and figure out how to explain what was still vague to her. She knew that if she didn't admit it, she would be tormented even more. But when the key turned in the lock on Friday night, her feet felt like they were stuck to the floor. Dan walked into the hallway carrying a suitcase and a laptop bag. His face was haggard and a cold determination read on it. He met her gaze but didn't say a word. Putting his things on the floor, he walked to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of water. We need to talk, Maggie's voice sounded muffled, almost lifeless. Dan took a sip and only then, turning slowly, did he answer. Yes, we do. Maggie stepped closer, her hands trembling. I'm not going to make excuses. I made a mistake. But that doesn't mean I don't want to make it right. Her voice trailed off and she felt tears come to her eyes. Dan looked at her in silence, his eyes full of fatigue and something new, disappointment. You know, Maggie, I've often wondered, when exactly did we stop being partners? When did you stop seeing me as someone you could trust with everything, without fear? His voice was quiet, but every word struck a nerve. I never stopped seeing you as important. I just lost, she whispered. He shook his head as if arguing with himself. I was trying to figure out what I was doing wrong. Why the job had become more important to us than we were to ourselves. But you know, in the last few weeks, I've realized it's not just about us. You chose this. You did. Maggie could hardly bear his cold stare, but she couldn't look away. Dan, I want to make this right. Give me a chance to prove that I still believe in us. He was silent for a moment, then sighed. Do you believe in yourself? Because I doubt it. His words hung in the air, heavy as lead. You know what's ironic? While you were busy doing your thing, Haley offered to help me with the project, support me. She was more reliable than you. Maggie felt her heart squeeze. Haley? You talk about her like she's a part of our lives, she said, barely breathing. She was there for you when you left. And no, we didn't have anything, if that's what you're thinking. His eyes flashed with anger. But perhaps if I had had the same weakness as you, things would have been different. Maggie sat in the darkness of her bedroom at night, staring at the silhouettes of furniture that had witnessed her mistakes. Dan's words rattled around in her head. The accusation against her was fair, and she couldn't deny it. The fear of losing him suddenly slammed into her with renewed force, and she realized she had to fight for them, even if it was the last thing she did. She decided to meet with Ryan the next morning to set the record straight once and for all. She needed to finish this before she could try to get Dan back. She texted him. "Ryan, we need to talk. Meet me at the coffee shop on the corner at 1 o'clock? The reply came quickly. "Sure. I'll be there." The cafe was half empty, and Maggie chose a table by the window. It was raining lightly outside and the drops dripped down the glass, giving the illusion of tears. Ryan walked in, shaking his hair out of the water, and smiled when he noticed her. But this time his smile didn't bring a wave of warmth to her. "Hey Maggie. Something wrong?" He sat down across from her, looking at her intently. She nodded, setting aside her cup of cooled coffee. "Ryan, this has to stop. Everything that was between us. It was a mistake. I can't do this anymore." His face darkened and he raised his eyebrows. "Are you serious? After everything?" His voice turned cold. "Yes. I love Dan. I made a mistake and I need to fix it," she said firmly, even though everything inside was tearing apart. Ryan hummed softly, his gaze hardening. "You know, Maggie, I never thought you were like this. I knew it was temporary, but I didn't expect you to end it so easily." "Not so easy," her voice shook, but she continued. "It's hard, but it's the right thing to do." Ryan nodded slowly, a shadow of disappointment flickering in his eyes. "I hope you're right," he said, rising from his chair. "I wish you luck, Maggie. But remember, one day you'll realize that you don't forget things like this." He walked away, leaving her to sit alone, watching the raindrops drip down the glass, merging into chaotic lines. Back at home, Maggie felt a surge of determination. She saw Dan in their shared living room. He was sitting with a folder in his hands, reading some documents intently. At her appearance he looked up. "Maggie, you're back." His voice was calm, but his warmth was gone. "Yes. There's something I have to tell you. I met with Ryan and I put a stop to it. It won't change what I did, but I want you to know that I'm willing to fight for us." Dan looked at her, and something resembling hope flashed in his eyes, but he quickly hid it behind a mask of indifference. "I'm glad you've decided to take responsibility for your actions. But fighting isn't just words, Maggie," he said, standing up. "Let's see if you're strong enough for something more." It had been a week since Maggie had put an end to her relationship with Ryan. She felt both relieved and devastated at the same time. Every day was an ordeal. She caught herself waiting for Dan to speak to her, if only to ease the tension in their home. But he was silent, keeping his distance, though he didn't hide behind his work the way he used to. One evening, when the clock on the kitchen wall struck 9, Maggie noticed Dan coming home earlier than usual. He stood in the hallway, slowly taking off his coat as if he were gathering his thoughts. She couldn't stand this silence any longer. "Dan, why don't we talk?" she said, stepping closer. He nodded, his gaze hard and serious. They sat down at the living room table, where the smell of old coffee and the cold dinner she'd never gotten around to eating was in the air. "Maggie, I've been thinking a lot," Dan began, avoiding her gaze. "About us, about what happened and what's going to happen next. And you know, I'm not sure I can live like this." Her heart clenched, but she decided to hold on. "I know," she whispered. "I know it's not going to be easy to get it all back. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Dan looked at her carefully, his eyes full of fatigue and pain. "Have you ever thought that our relationship has come to a standstill not only because of your infidelity?" he said suddenly, and her eyes widened in surprise. "I was to blame for what was going on too. I got so caught up in my work and career that I forgot I had a wife who needed something more than just daily conversations about bills and appointments." Maggie was flabbergasted. She'd thought all the blame was on her, but to hear Dan admit his mistakes was unexpectedly painful and refreshing. "Yes," she replied, nodding, "I've been thinking about that too. We've both made mistakes, Dan. But if we're together, maybe we have a chance to make things right?" He was silent, his fingers nervously skimming the edge of the table. "I want to believe it's possible," he said, but his voice sounded like he was saying it more to himself than to her. The next day, when Maggie arrived at work, there was an unusual silence in the office. The co-workers, usually immersed in their work, seemed to be waiting for something. She walked over to her workstation and noticed Haley, who was talking to someone in sales but kept throwing short glances at Maggie. When the clock struck lunchtime, Maggie went to the small meeting room to get a coffee and get her thoughts in order a bit. She was standing by the window when the door opened and Haley walked in. Her face was serious, with not a trace of the friendly mask she wore in front of others. "Maggie, can I talk to you?" Her voice was calm, but there was something cold in it. "Of course," Maggie replied, clutching the cup as if it would protect her from an unexpected visit. "I know something happened between you and Dan," Haley began, lowering her eyes. "And, I've been thinking about whether or not to tell you about it for a long time, but I thought you should know the truth." "The truth? About what?" Maggie frowned, her heart beating faster. "About Ryan. Did you think that was over?" Haley grinned a little, but her gaze remained serious. "He was just using you and I helped him do it." Maggie felt the floor beneath her feet begin to wobble. Her eyes went wide and the words froze on her tongue. "You helped him?" she repeated, not believing her ears. "Yes. I knew you were in search of something more, and he was the perfect bait to tear you and Dan apart. And then," she paused as if savoring every word, "I thought it would give me a chance with Dan." Maggie was silent, unable to believe that such truth had been revealed to her. Haley watched her, studying her reaction. "What?" she finally asked, feeling anger rising in her chest. "Why would you do that?" "Because I'm in love with him. And you, Maggie, ruined him slowly day by day. You didn't deserve him." Her voice became harsh, almost accusatory. "You don't know anything about our relationship," Maggie shouted, her voice trembling. "Nothing. I know more than you think," Haley replied, arms crossed. "And if you think you can just walk away and pretend like nothing happened, you're wrong. The truth always comes out." Maggie walked out of the room, her hands shaking and one thought rattling around in her head. She was a pawn in someone else's game. Her betrayal had become a tool in the hands of a woman she thought was just a co-worker. Walking back to her desk, she met her gaze with Ryan, who was standing by the coffee machine. He was looking at her blankly, as if she was something devoid of significance. She realized she had to talk to Dan immediately. That evening when Dan came home, Maggie sat in the living room, arms crossed, waiting for him. When he walked in, she stood up without waiting for an invitation to begin. "Dan, I have something to tell you and it's important." Her voice was strained. He nodded slowly and sat down across from her. "I found out today that everything that happened was planned. Haley and Ryan, they used me to destroy our marriage," she said, looking him straight in the eye. Dan frowned, his face petrified. "What do you mean?" he asked slowly, as if he feared the answer. "Haley confessed to me today. She pushed Ryan toward me, knowing I might give in. Everything was set up for us to break up." Her voice shook, but she spoke with firmness. Dan stood up, walked around the room and stopped at the window, staring out into the darkness. His hands clenched into fists. "Is that why you decided to tell me now?" His voice was filled with bitterness. "Because you were set up?" "No," Maggie said, standing up and coming closer. "Because I want you to know the truth. Yes, I made a mistake, but it was part of something bigger. You deserve to know that." Dan turned around, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment there was a flicker of doubt in them. "Even if it's true, what am I supposed to do with this information now, Maggie? I can't forget what I saw. I can't forget how I felt when I realized you were with someone else." She lowered her eyes, accepting his words. "I understand. And I know we can't go back to the way things were. But maybe we can start somewhere new." With the truth, she took a step back, letting him decide. Dan was silent for a long moment, his gaze going deep into himself until he sighed. "I don't know if I can," he finally said quietly, and there was a pain in his voice that he could no longer hide. And in that moment, Maggie realized that the struggle had just begun. Saturday morning was unusually sunny, which contrasted with the gloom that had settled over Maggie and Dan's house. Maggie sat at the kitchen table, a cup of cold coffee in front of her. She stared at the liquid like a mirror that reflected her mistakes and doubts. It had been a few days since she'd told Dan about Haley's confession. They both tried to live their lives as if nothing had changed, but the tension in the air was palpable. Dan walked into the kitchen, his face serious and focused. He sat down across from her, placing a stack of papers on the table. "Maggie, we need to decide what to do next," he said without taking his eyes off her. She sighed, knowing this moment was inevitable. "I know. I've been thinking about us, about what we've been through. And I know it's impossible to go back, but I don't want to lose you." Her voice was shaky but determined. Dan nodded slowly, taking one of the documents and flipping through it. "Here are the terms of the divorce if we decide to go down this road," he said, his voice flat but painful. "I haven't filed them yet, but I need you to know I'm ready." Maggie had a hard time swallowing the lump that rose in her throat. "Dan, I'm fine with you wanting a divorce. I understand if you decide to leave. But I need to know one thing, can you even try to forgive me?" Her eyes met his and she tried to find a glimmer of hope in them. Dan leaned back in his chair, his hands clenched into fists. The problem is I don't know, Maggie. You confessed to me and I respect that. You told me about how you were used and that explains a lot but not everything. I'm not sure I can forget that you went along willingly. Silence filled the room, tearing it apart. Maggie stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the small yard of wilted flowers. Her voice was quiet when she finally spoke. I'm ready for a fresh start if you'll give me a chance. I know we can't go back to the way things were, but maybe we don't need to go back but try to create something new? Dan didn't answer right away, his gaze was fixed on the papers in front of him. Maybe, he said at last, and there was a tiredness in his voice. But we both need time. To figure out what we want and what we deserve. That evening, Maggie went for a walk around the city to clear her mind. Her feet led her to the old park where she and Dan used to spend time picnicking and reading books under the oak trees. She sat down on a wooden bench, her gaze sliding over the lawn filled with children's games and the laughter of young couples. Sadness enveloped her like a fog. Reflecting on the past? A voice sounded nearby and she flinched. When she turned around, she saw Haley standing in front of her, dressed in a light cloak. Her eyes glittered with cold interest. What are you doing here? Maggie asked, struggling to keep her voice from breaking. Just taking a walk. This is a public place, isn't it? Haley grinned, then sat down on the bench next to her. I wonder what you're doing out here by yourself. Did Dan leave? It's none of your business, Maggie replied sharply, feeling the anger rising inside. Maybe it isn't, Haley shrugged. But you know Dan deserves better. And in case you're wondering, I've never stopped fighting to make him realize that. Maggie turned to her, her gaze filled with contempt. You don't understand what he means to me. You ruined our marriage for your own selfish purposes. Oh, I understand exactly what he means to you, Haley met her gaze. But you gave him that chance when you chose Ryan. Maggie couldn't help herself and stood up, feeling the anger and despair overwhelm her. Walk away, Haley. And stay out of our lives, she said, trying to sound firm. Whatever you say, Haley replied, standing up and carelessly adjusting her cloak. But remember, Maggie, the game isn't over. When Maggie got home, Dan was sitting in the living room watching an old soccer game on TV. His gaze was detached and he didn't immediately notice her. She sat down next to him and for a moment they were silent. I saw Haley, Maggie said, breaking the silence. Dan flinched and looked at her. What were you talking about? He asked, frowning. About you, about us. She made it clear that she's still hoping for you, Maggie said, her voice calm but her eyes burning. Haley? Dan sighed heavily, then shook his head. I appreciated her support, but I never took her seriously. I thought you understood that. I do, Maggie replied. And I'm not going to let her interfere in our lives anymore. Dan nodded thoughtfully and stood up, turning off the TV. He went to the window and looked out at the street lights in silence for a while. I want to try it, he finally said. But let's be honest, it's going to be hard. And it might not work out. Maggie stepped toward him, her heart beating faster. I'm ready for this. Just give us a chance. Dan turned to her, a faint smile flickering in his eyes. Okay, he said, squeezing her hand. Let's try it. And in that moment, despite all the mistakes and pain, they had hope. It had been months since Maggie and Dan had decided to give their relationship another chance. The house was full of sounds again, laughter, talking, sometimes arguing, but it was all alive and real. Every day was a struggle to trust and rebuild what once seemed lost. Maggie and Dan saw a marriage counselor, and it became something of a ritual for them, time devoted just to them, without distractions or blame. One evening, after a long day at work, Maggie came home carrying bags of groceries. Dan was in the kitchen sorting through papers, his face focused. Hi, she said, setting the bags on the table. How was your day? Hi, Dan looked up and smiled. There was a lot of work, but nothing critical. And you? I'm good. I think it's time to think about taking a vacation together, she suggested, trying to bring some lightness into the conversation. It had been so long since they'd discussed anything other than work and therapy sessions. Dan nodded thoughtfully, then walked over to her and took her hand. That's a good idea. I think we both need a little break from everything that's been going on. Maggie squeezed his hand and felt a spark run between them that reminded her why she'd fought for this marriage. They were still here, still together. Rumors of their relationship were spreading around the office, but it didn't bother Maggie anymore. She stopped paying attention to the whispers behind her back and the reproachful looks. Work was once again a place where she could be productive and focused. One day as she was checking email, Ryan walked up to her desk. His face was serious and didn't have that usual cocky smile on it. Hi, he said quietly, looking at her. Maggie looked up and nodded. Hey Ryan. Is something wrong? I wanted to say I'm sorry about the way things turned out. I didn't think it would go this far. His voice was sincere, and a shadow of regret could be heard in it. She looked at him, feeling a mixture of anger and sympathy. Ryan, our decisions have consequences and I think we both realize that. I've forgiven you, but that doesn't mean I'll forget. Her voice was firm but soft. He nodded, realizing he couldn't have expected any other answer. I understand. I just wanted to say that. Ryan left, and Maggie felt another piece of her past closing up, letting her go to her new life. At home in the late afternoon, Dan sat on the couch, piled with folders of work. Maggie walked over to him and sat next to him, watching the lamp light bring his tired face out of the shadows. She reached out and stroked his shoulder. Dan, let's save this for tomorrow. Let's go to bed, she said quietly. He smiled and set the folder aside. You know, you're right. Work can wait. They went upstairs together to the bedroom, where the dim light created a cozy atmosphere. Dan put his arm around her and they stood like that in silence, enjoying a rare moment of peace. I'm glad we didn't give up, he whispered, his voice filled with warmth. Maggie closed her eyes and allowed herself to smile. I am too. And in that silence, amidst the night sounds of the city, they felt like they were starting a new chapter of their lives without lies, without pain, but with lessons that would stay with them forever. And that concludes our story today. Thank you for watching to the end. If you liked it, please give it a like and leave a comment. Also, we are always happy to discuss any comments you may have. See you in the next video.